everyone, my name is Catubig and I will be recording the part 1 of chapter 4 of Test and Testing. There are some assumptions about psychological testing and assessment. Assumption 1. Psychological traits and states exist. Guilford, 1959, page 6, defined trait as any distinguishable, relatively enduring way in which one individual varies from one another. And Chaplin et al. 1988 says that states also distinguish one person from another, but relatively less enduring. The term trait itself covers a wide range of possible characteristics. Thousands of psychological trait terms can be found in the English language. And one of those is that yung psychological traits na related to intelligence, specific intellectual abilities, cognitive style, adjustment, interest, attitudes, sexual orientation and preferences, psychopathology, personality in general, and specific personality traits. And maybe in the future, there will be new concepts or discoveries in research that may bring new trait terms. Example ng trait term na makikita sa professional literature on human sexuality or gender. Siguro, alam naman natin na when it comes to sexuality, biologically dalawa lang, babae at saka lalaki. But when it comes to gender, napakarami na. Woman, man, gay, lesbian, transgender, queer, maraming plus, LGBTQ+. But, may term tayo na nabuo out of the professional literature on human sexuality, and that is androgynous or androgynous. It is referring to an absence of primacy of male or female characteristics. Best example nito is Vice Ganda. He said in the Showtime that way back when he was in Hong Kong, I think it was in Hong Kong, a lot of people is having a hard time distinguishing whether he is a man or a woman because of his fashion, the way he dressed himself. It's kind of hard to distinguish his sexuality. That's what other people thought about him. Same lang din ito pagdating sa cultural evolution. Yung cultural evolution, nagdadala rin siya ng mga bagong trait terms into common usage. Just like what happens in 1960s when people began speaking of the degree to which women were liberated. Liberated means freed from the constraints of gender-dependent social expectations. Yung term natin ngayon, mayroon ng wild, napaka-free na ng mga tao na gawin nila yung mga gusto nila. And a more recent example in the trait term is the New Age, used in the popular culture to refer to a particular non-mainstream orientation to spirituality and health. Despite the explanations about trait, marami pa rin mga tao na hindi naniniwala na yung traits, psychological traits, ay nag-i-exist. Totoo ba talaga siya? So, marami nagtatanong, do traits have physical existence? Perhaps a circuit in the brain? So, naghahanap sila ngayon ng ebidensya. And marami ng mga psychologists yung nakipag-argue in favor sa conception ng psychological traits. Pero, nahihirapan pa rin sila na maghanap ng mga ebidensya na susuporta dun sa view nila na nag-i-exist talaga physically yung traits. And for our purposes, it says that a psychological trait exists only as a construct. A construct means an informed scientific concept developed or constructed to describe or explain behavior. Hindi man natin makita, mahawakan, o marinig yung construct, but we can infer their existence from overt behavior. And in this context, overt behavior refers to an observable action or the product of an observable action, including test or assessment-related responses. And it is a very challenging aspect for test developers to construct tests that are at least telling us observable behavior. Another example of overt behavior or observable behavior is the measuring sensation seeking. According to Zuckerman 1979, page 10, the psychological trait of sensation seeking has been defined as the need for varied, novel, and complex sensations and experiences, and the willingness to take physical and social risk for the sake of such experiences. So, ang binigay na example rito is that assuming the SSS or the sensation seeking scale measures what it purports to measure. And how would you expect a random sample of people lining up to bungee jump to score on the test as compared with another age-matched sample of people shopping at the local mall? Yung SSS pala, I forgot to mention, a 22-item sensation seeking scale, SSS, seeks to identify people who are high or low on that trait, which is sensation seeking. Mas mataas ba yung willingness ng mga taong nagsha-shopping lang sa mall or yung mga taong nagla-lining up para tumalon sa bangin? Sino yung mas may, who are those people na may high or low sa trait na sensation seeking? Kung sino yung mas willing mag-take ng risk for the sake of experiencing something that is somewhat pleasurable to them. Assumption number 2, psychological traits and states can be quantified and measured. Since psychological traits and states has been acknowledged to exist, we can now assume that it can be quantified and measured. Dito malalaman natin kung gaano ba kalala ang isang term base sa kung paano natin ito gamitin o ginagamit. For example, ay yung word na aggressive. Pwedeng sabihin na aggressive yung salesperson, aggressive yung killer, aggressive yung waiter, di ba ba? And the aggressive there carries a different meaning, each of them. Kung isang test personality ay magpo-provide ng isang information on how aggressive a test taker is, ang first step na maiintindihan mo kung anong ibig sabihin ng score niya is that paano ba dinefine ng test developer yung aggressive na word doon. For example, magbibigay siya ng mild, severe, severe aggressiveness, mild aggressiveness, and so on. And more specifically, what types of behaviors are presumed to be indicative of someone who is aggressive as defined by the test? Pwede yung isang developer, i-define niya yung aggressive behavior as the number of self-reported acts of physically harming others. So, yun yung, kumbaga, yung severeness ng isang task. Pwede rin na yung isang task developer, define niya yung aggressiveness as the number of observed acts of aggression, such as pushing, hitting, or kicking, that occur in a playground setting. In other words, yung task developer ang magbibigay ng operational definition sa isang task users or yung task taker para maintindihan niya yung score na makukuha niya sa task na ibinibigay sa kanya. Measuring traits and states by means of a task entails developing not only appropriate task items but also appropriate ways to score the task and interpret the results. And for many varieties of psychological tasks, some number representing the score on the test is derived from the examinee's responses. The test score is presumed to represent the strength of the targeted ability or trait or state and is frequently based on what we call cumulative scoring. Assumption number 3, task-related behavior predicts non-task-related behavior. The task in some tasks mimic the actual behaviors that the task user is attempting to understand. Meaning na yung task na ibinigay sa kanya is situational. It was based on reality. Ibig sabihin na kung ano yung isasagot niya dun sa test ay maaari niya rin gawin in real life. The obtained sample of behavior is typically used to make predictions about future behavior such as work performance of a job applicant. And I do believe that our behavior and actions are pretty much consistent. On the other side, in forensic legal matters, nagbibigay sila ng test hindi para i-predict ang isang behavior, kundi i-post-dick ito. Para malaman nila kung bakit ginawa ng isang kriminal, o ipaglagay na natin, kriminal, yung ginawa niya, bakit niya yung ginawa, ano ang dahilan. Post-dicting the behavior can aid in the understanding of behavior that has already taken place, yung nangyari na. Malalaman mo kung bakit ginawa niya yung ginawa niya. Assumption number 4. Task and other measurement techniques have strengths and weaknesses. Competent test users understand a great deal about the task they use. Yung mga test users, alam nila yung scope and limitations ng mga testing materials or assessment na ginagawa nila o ibinibigay nila. They understand, among other things, how a test was developed, the circumstances under which it is appropriate to administer the test, how the test should be administered, and para kanino yung mga test. and how the test results should be interpreted. And it has been said that competent test users understand and appreciate the limitations of the test they use, as well as how those limitations might be compensated for by data from other sources. All in all, test users knows the test they use and aware of the test limitations. And they said that it is emphasized repeatedly in the codes of ethics of associations of assessment professionals. Assumption number 5. Various sources of error are part of the assessment process. In our everyday conversation, we use the word error to refer to mistakes, miscalculations, and the like. But in the context of assessment, error traditionally refers to something that is more than expected. It is actually a component of the measurement process. Specifically, it refers to a long-standing assumption that factors other than what a test attempts to measure will influence performance on the test. We must remember that test scores are always subject to questions about the degree to which the measurement process includes error. For example, an intelligence test score could be subject to debate concerning the degree to which the obtained score truly reflects the examinee's intelligence and the degree to which it was due to factors other than intelligence. For example, to make it clear, alam mo na yung kapatid mo medyo mahina sa math. Ngayon, binigyan siya ng test sa math ng kanyang teacher. Doon sa school, i-consider natin na face-to-face. Tapos, yung score niya, nagkaroon ng checking, yung score niya, sobrang laki. Ang laki-laki ng score na nakuha niya. Halos perfect na. Ngayon, aalamin mo kung ano yung naging variable. Ano yung variable na nagbigay sa kanya ng malaking score. And that is what we call the error of variance. Diyan napapasok yung error of variance, which means that the component of a test score attributable to sources other than the trait or ability measured. Medyo complicated talaga tong assessment kasi nagkaroon ka na ng score, pero hindi ka agad maniniwala na yun talaga yung fix na talaga yung mga sagot nila. Kasi may mga variable na nagtutulak sa kanila or naging epekto o nagkaroon ng epekto sa kanila kung bakit yun ang pinili nilang sagot. Ganun. On the other hand, instructors who teach the undergraduate measurement course will occasionally hear a student refer to error as creeping into or contaminating the measurement process. Yet, measurement professionals tend to view error as simply an element in the process of measurement, one for which any theory of measurement must surely account. And that is what we call or refer to as classical test theory, the CCT, also variously referred to as true score theory. The assumption is made that each test taker has a true score on the test that would be obtained but for the action of measurement error, but for the measurement of test taker has a true score on a test that would be obtained but for the action of measurement error. So magkakaroon na ng consideration sa pagkakaintindi ko, excuse me, sa pagkakaintindi ko, magkakaroon na ng consideration sa mga variable na naka-apekto, affecting variable, at paniniwalaan na nila na yung nakuhang score na isang test taker ay totoo na talaga. Pero dapat yung tandaan na lahat ng mga model of measurement na ginagamit, may way sila para i-account yung measurement of error. Para, kumbaga, i-take in nila kung paano nila i-measure yung error. Kung okay lang ba natanggapin yun or hindi. Depende lang yun kung anong klase ng test or theory or model of measurement to be exact. For example, IRT or the item response theory. Okay, weather and self concept. There is research to suggest that self-reported personality ratings may differ depending upon the weather on the day that the self-report was made. That's according to Ramstead et al. 2015. This research is instructive regarding the extent to which random situational conditions, such as the weather on the day of an assessment, may affect the expression of traits. So, ito yung sinasabi ko kanina na affecting variable. For example, dito sa picture, kung masaya ka dahil maaraw, edi yung sagot mo, maaaring tungkol din or paano ba ito sasabihin? Okay. Masaya ka sa araw na yan kasi maaraw. May araw. Masaya ka. Edi, yung test na ibinigay sa'yo, posible na positive lahat yung result o yung score mo ba ay mataas sa isang trait na gustong malaman ng isang administrator o yung nagbibigay ng test. Assumption number 6. Testing and assessment can be conducted in a fair and unbiased manner. It is said to be a more controversial assumption than the remaining 6. And in all questions about tests with regards to fairness, it is important to keep in mind that tests are tools and they can be used properly or improperly. Ibig sabihin, magdidepende sa mga test administrators and test publishers kung magiging fair ba sila sa result na makukuha or gagamitin ba nila ito properly or improperly. Sa kasalukuyan, lahat ng mga test publishers ay nagsastrive hard para mag-develop ng mga instruments na fair yung paggamit at nagpa-follow siya strictly according to the guidelines in the test manual. Hindi pa rin talaga may iwasan na magkakaroon ng problema about the biased usage of the testing material. Okay, the last assumption, number 7, testing and assessment benefit society. A world without tests would most likely be more a nightmare than a dream. Is this true? Yeah, I think it is. In such a world, people could present themselves as surgeons, bridge builders, or airline pilots, regardless of their background, ability, or professional credentials. In a world without tests or other assessment procedures, personnel might be hired on the basis of nepotism rather than documented merit. Magkakaroon na rin ng biases sa pag-hire ng personnel. Imbes na mag-hire ka, kung may company ka, imbes na mag-hire ka ng personnel na may pinag-aralan talaga, nakapagtapos, maraming mga documented merits, hindi na. Yung pipiliin mo na lang yung mga kilala mo. Yung kilala mo, kaibigan mo, relatives mo, affiliated sa'yo, or affiliated sa kaibigan mo, circle of friends, yung tinatawag na nepotism. Ito pa, another example is that in a world without tests, there would be a great need for instruments to diagnose educational difficulties in reading and math and point the way to remediation. And also, in a world without tests, there would be no instruments to diagnose neuropsychological impairments. And also, there will be no practical way for the military to screen thousands of recruits with regard to many key variables. For example, sa profession na, sa seaman, yung mga seaman, alam ko, bawal sa kanila yung mga colorblind na mga tao. Paano nila malalaman na colorblind yung isang tao kung walang test na ibibigay sa kanya? Diba? Napakasama. Paano yung red light? Paano yung red light? Ibig sabihin dangerous. Yung green, go. Paano niya malalaman na mag-go na siya? Hindi niya nga alam yung kulay. Diba? So, it is important na magkaroon talaga ng test at assessment para sa ikabubuti nating lahat. Now, I will play a short video that will aid in your understanding.
Welcome to another video by Psychology for Life. Today I will be discussing differences between psychological testing and assessment, assumptions of psychological assessment, and evaluating a psychological test. The words assessment and testing are often used interchangeably, but there are important distinctions between the two. Psychological assessment is defined as the gathering and integration of psychology-related data for the purpose of making a psychological evaluation that is accomplished through the use of tools such as tests, interviews, case studies, behavioral observation, and specially designed apparatuses and measurement procedures. On the other hand, psychological testing is the process of measuring psychology-related variables by means of devices or procedures designed to obtain a sample of behavior. Based on the definition, you can see that assessment is broader than testing. In fact, testing can be considered as one of the procedures used in assessment. The first important distinction between testing and assessment is in their objective. Testing is usually carried out to obtain a gauge, usually numerical in nature, with regard to an ability or attribute of a person. On the other hand, assessment is done to answer a referral question, solve a problem, or arrive at a decision through the use of tools of evaluation. The second major distinction between testing and assessment is in the process of carrying them out. Testing can be done individually or in groups, but the process usually involves administering a test and generating a score. In assessment, the process involves carefully observing the individual to determine not just his or her scores, but his or her psychological functioning. A third major distinction between testing and assessment is in the skill of the evaluator. Testing usually requires technician-like skills in terms of administering and scoring a test, as well as in interpreting a test results. On the other hand, assessment usually requires an educated selection of tools of evaluation, skill in evaluation, and thoughtful organization and integration of data. Let us now turn to the assumptions of psychological assessment. The field of testing and assessment has a lot of disagreement and debate. However, the assumptions that will be discussed are the general agreements that are held by those engaged in this field. Without them, the field cannot move forward and carry out its work. The first major assumption is that psychological traits and states exist. A trait has been defined as any distinguishable, relatively enduring way in which one individual varies from another. States also distinguish one person from another but are relatively less enduring. The second major assumption is that psychological states and traits can be quantified and measured. Once it is acknowledged that psychological traits and states do exist, then it can also be assumed that they can be quantified and measured. Of course, there are so many debates as to the best way to measure these traits and states. The challenge is to find the best way to measure these traits and states in a way that reflects their existence in real life. The third major assumption is that test-related behavior predicts non-test-related behavior. In other words, we expect that a person's scores on different psychological states and traits will predict whether a person will manifest these states or traits in his or her life. The fourth major assumption is that psychological tests and other measurement techniques have strengths and weaknesses. They are fallible instruments, so it is crucial to know their limitations and to know when to use them. The fifth assumption is that various sources of error are always present in the measurement process. The key here is to learn the techniques to minimize these sources of error or to mitigate their effects so that the results of assessment can be useful and not invalid. The sixth assumption is that testing and assessment can be conducted in a fair and unbiased manner. It is important to keep in mind that tests are tools, and just like any other tools such as hammers, ice picks, or wrenches, they can be used properly or improperly. We need to know the possible sources of bias or unfairness in assessment so that we can find ways to overcome them. Finally, the last assumption is that testing and assessment can benefit society. A world without tests might seem appealing, but a world without tests will probably lead to more chaos and disorder. Many critical decisions are based on assessment and testing, and the key is not to remove them, but to improve them. The last part of this overview is about evaluating a psychological test. What are the characteristics of a good psychological test? The first thing to consider in evaluating a test is its theoretical orientation. Before we can evaluate whether a test is appropriate, we must first understand its theoretical orientation. We must research the construct that the test is supposed to be measuring, and then examine the process that the test uses to measure this construct. The second thing to consider in evaluating a test is its usefulness. If a test is too long, the test takers may become so frustrated that the way they answer may invalidate the results. Other factors such as the reading level of the test and culturally biased items may also make it less useful. Another important consideration in evaluating a test is the process carried out in order to standardize it. Crucial here is to check the norms to which the test taker's scores will be compared. The norms are usually generated from a sample of people called the standardization sample. We need to ask 3 questions regarding the standardization sample. 1. Does it represent the population of intended test takers? 2. Is the standardization sample large enough? And 3. Are there subgroup norms? These points will be explained in more detail in another video on test standardization. Another important thing to consider in evaluating a psychological test is its reliability. The reliability of a test refers to its degree of stability, consistency, and predictability. It addresses the extent to which scores obtained by a person are or would be the same if the person is re-examined by the same test on different occasions. Reliability will be discussed in more detail in another video. Perhaps the most important consideration of all in evaluating a psychological test is its validity. Whereas reliability addresses issues of consistency, validity assesses whether a test truly measures the trait it is supposed to measure. Validity is so important that another video is dedicated to it. Thank you very much for watching this overview of psychological testing and assessment. The following are the references for this video. Credits to Pixabay for the pictures used in this video and Bensound for the music.
Okay, now the big question is, what's a good test? Logically, the criteria for a good test would include clear instructions for administration, scoring, and interpretation. It would also seem to be a plus if a test offered economy in the time and money it took to administer, score, and interpret it. Most of all, a good test would seem to be one that measures what it purports to measure. And beyond simple logic, there are technical criteria that assessment professionals use to evaluate the quality of tests and other measurement procedures. Test users often speak of you're very familiar about it, the psychometric soundness of tests, two key aspects of which are known as reliability and validity. Reliability. The criterion of reliability involves consistency of the measuring tool, the precision with which the test measures, and the extent to which error is present in measurements. For example, visualize 3 digital scales labeled A, B, and C. To determine if they are reliable measuring tools, we will use a standard 1-pound gold bar that has been certified by experts to indeed weigh 1 pound and not a fraction of an ounce more or less. In repeated weighings of the 1-pound bar on the scale A, register a reading of 1 pound every time. So, every time na tinitimbang yung 1 pound na gold bar, 1 pound talaga siya. Kahit ilang ulit mo pa siya, 1 pound. So, there is consistency. Now, on the scale B, repeated weighings of the bar on scale B yield a reading of 1.3 pounds. Now, the question is this scale reliable? Imagine every time na tinitimbang mo yung 1 pound na gold bar sa scale B, 1.3 talaga siya. Kahit ilang ulit mo pa siyang tinimbang, 1.3 talaga ang reading niya. Pero, ang tanong, reliable ba ang scale na to? Ang sagot ay oo, reliable to. Kasi, it may be consistently inaccurate by 0.3 of a pound, but there's no taking away the fact that it is reliable because it is consistent. Now, on scale C, repeated weighings of the bar on scale C register a different weight every time na tinimbang siya. Iba-iba yung weight na makukuha niya. On the first timbang niya, tinimbang siya ng 1.7 pound. Now, on the other timbang naman, pag tinimbang mo siya ulit, 0.9 na siya. So, hindi na siya consistent. Maaaring sa susunod mo pa na pagtimbang ng 1 pound gold bar, iba na naman yung resulta. So, hindi siya consistent. Basta, yung tatandaan nyo lang that reliability involves the consistency. It involves consistency. Validity. A test is considered valid for a particular purpose if it does, in fact, measure what it purports to measure. And for you to understand well the concept and the differences between reliability and validity, I will play a short video.
I'm Katarina Forrester Smith. I'm a senior psychometrician with Limited Education. You can think about it in terms of consistency of scores. If you test a student today and test a student tomorrow, our score is going to be similar, right? If you test one population of students and a different population of students, are you going to be seeing similar scores on the same assessment? And down to internal reliability, if you are administering the first part of the assessment to the students and the second part of the assessments, are the scores on the first part and the second part going to be similar? Are students performing on all of the items within any given assessment consistently? In a nutshell, test validity is whether any given assessment measures what it's supposed to measure. What we're trying to ascertain a lot of the times is content validity and criterion validity. Content validity, when we have item writers writing any given item, we're trying to make sure that the items align to certain standards, for example. In order to do this, we need multiple people making sure that the item aligns to a certain standard, or assessment as a whole aligns to a given number of standards, right? So having 3 people blindly aligning items or assessments to the standards, right? Having that content validity. On top of that, once the assessment is in production, what I do is criterion validity, right? How good of a predictor that assessment is to any other given instrument, any other given assessment. For example, end of year state assessment. So in order to do that, we correlate performance on any given assessment, benchmark any inspect assessment with state test performance or any other valid instrument, for example, ACT or SAT.
Other considerations. If the purpose of a test is to compare the performance of the test taker with the performance of other test takers, then a good test is one that contains adequate norms, also referred to as normative data. Norms provide a standard with which the result of measurement can be compared. And in putting a test to the test, there are a number of ways to evaluate just how good a test really is. Norms, in the singular, is used in the scholarly literature to refer to behavior that is usual, average, normal, standard, expected, or typical. And there are reference to a particular variety of norm may be specified by means of some modifiers. But in a psychometric context, norms are the test performance data of a particular group of test takers that are designed for use as a reference when evaluating or interpreting individual test scores. Ibig sabihin na yung individual test scores, para makuha yung interpretation niya, ikukumpara siya doon sa performance, sa test performance data ng isang particular na grupo na binigyan din ng same test, pero kabuang score ang i-compare sa individual test scores. Putting test to the test. For experts in the field of testing and assessment, certain questions occur almost reflexively in evaluating a test or measurement technique. The following questions here are the questions need to consider. First is, why use this particular instrument or method? Sa dami ng mga available tools na pwedeng gamitin ng isang professional na isang professionals or test publishers, hindi talaga maiwasang itanong kung bakit yun ang napili nilang test over the other. And that question leads to another question na naman kung kung ano, para kanino, para saan, paano, yung mga ganong tanong. At pagkatapos itanong sa iyo kung bakit yun ang pinili mo, magtatanong na naman, are there any published guidelines for the use of this test? Measurement professionals make it their business to be aware of published guidelines from the professional associations and related organizations for the use of test and measurement techniques. It is because sometimes a published guideline for the use of a particular test will list other measurement tools that should also be used along with it. For example, consider the case of psychologists called upon to provide input to a court in a matter of a child custody decision. More specifically, the court has asked the psychologist for expert opinion regarding an individual's parenting capacity. And many psychologists who perform such evaluations use a psychological test as a part of evaluation process. However, the psychologist performing such an evaluation is or should be aware of the guidelines promulgated by the American Psychological Association's Committee on Professional Practice and Standards. And these guidelines describe 3 types of assessments relevant to a child custody decision. First is that the assessment of parenting capacity. Second, the assessment of psychological and developmental needs of a child. And the third is that the assessment of the goodness of fit between the parent capacity and the child's needs. And according to these guidelines, an evaluation of a parent or even 2 parents is not sufficient to arrive at an opinion regarding custody. Rather, an educated opinion about who should be awarded custody can be arrived at only after evaluating first the parents or others seeking custody, the child, and the goodness fit between the needs and capacity of each parties. In that example, published guidelines inform us that any instrument the assessor selects to obtain information about parenting capacity must be supplemented with other instruments or procedures designed to support any expressed opinion, conclusion, or recommendation. We just have to remember that published guidelines and research, sila yung mga nagbibigay ng useful information kung paano natin isasagawa ang isang assessment, kung may kailangan pa bang gawing assessment sa ibang uri ng test or assessment na ginagawa. And how this particular test or measurement technique is to meet standards set by courts or even kahit hindi sa korte, kahit sa paaralan or sa kahit anong organization or institution. Next question, is this instrument reliable? I've mentioned earlier that reliability is involved or concerned about the consistency of measurement or tools. Reliability is somewhat difficult to attain since it requires data that would require a certain professionals or publisher to accept or reject the hypothesis on their test that has been put to the test that they're putting to the test. After the question of reliability, the next one is that Is this instrument valid? As we have learned, validity refers to the extent to which a test measures what it purports to measure. And as was the case with questions concerning a particular instrument's reliability, research to determine whether a particular instrument is valid starts with a careful reading of the test manual as well as published research on the test reviews, and other related sources. And once again, as you might have anticipated, there will not necessarily be any simple answers at the end of the preliminary research about the test. Under the context of validity, is this instrument cost effective? During World Wars I and II, the military needed to quickly screen hundreds of thousands of recruits for intelligence. It may have been desirable to individually administer a Bennett intelligence test to each recruit, but it would have taken a great deal of time. Too much time. And given the demands of war, and it would not have been very cost-effective. Instead, the armed services developed group measures of intelligence that could be administered quickly and that address needs more efficiently than an individually administered test. In this instance, it could be said that group tests had greater utility than individual tests. Sa kasagsagan ng World War I and II, ginamit nila yung isang intelligence test para makarecruit ng mga military. But nagkaroon sila ng problema kasi gusto nila paspasan yung pag-recruit, yung pagkuha ng isang personnel. Pero nagkaroon sila ng solusyon, which is instead na individual nila ibibigay yung test, gumawa sila ng grupo, binay-group nila. The administration of the test was by group, and na-realize nila na mas importante pala, nagkaroon pala ng state of being useful at beneficial yung paggrupo nila kaysa sa individual task. Kasi mas napadali yung trabaho nila. And the last question is that what inferences may reasonably be made from this test score and how generalizable are the findings? It is said that in evaluating a test, it is critical to consider the inferences that may reasonably be made as a result of administering that test. The problem here, ang problema dito, is yung generalizability. Yeah, that's the right term. Sorry. Many other factors may affect the generalizability of the test findings. For example, if the items on a test are worded in such a way as to be less comprehensible by members of a specific group, then the use of that test with members of that group could be questionable. Kung yung test na ibinigay ay hindi maintindihan ng isang miyembro ng specific na group, ibig sabihin walang silbi yung pagbibigay or the administration of tests to that specific group is not useful at all. In other words, they are not compatible with the test that has been given to them. Another issue regarding the generalizability of findings concerns how a test was administered. It is because most published tests include explicit directions for testing conditions and test administration procedures that must be followed to the letter. If a test administration deviates in any way from these directions, the generalizability of the findings may be compromised. Another thing is the culture. Culture is also a variable that must be taken account of in the development of a new test as well as the administration, scoring, and interpretation of any test. So kung gagawa ka ng isang test, kailangan mo ring i-consider yung culture ng mga tao na i-administeran mo, yung tao na i-put mo sa test or yung test takers. Next is the norm, reference, testing, and assessment. This is all what we have been talking about. It is a method of evaluation and a way of deriving meaning from test scores by evaluating an individual test taker score and comparing it to the scores of a group of test takers. The next one is, this is also related to normative sample. Ito yung grupo ng test takers na kung saan isinasabak sila sa isang test, binibigyan sila ng test para kukunin yung mga scores nila, tsaka ikukumpara doon sa individual test scores for interpretation purposes. Normative sample is that group of people whose performance on a particular test is analyzed for reference in evaluating the performance of individual test takers. Norming. It's related to naming because norming refers to the process of deriving norms. For example, race norming is the controversial practice of norming on the basis of race or ethnic background. In race norming, kasali na naman si culture dito. Culture is involved. Race norming was once engaged in by some government agencies and private organizations, and the practice resulted in the establishment of different cut-off scores for hiring by cultural group. Just like here in the Philippines, sa pagkakaalam ko, yung PNP, may required height sila para sa kanilang mga personnel. Pero kapag member ka ng ethnic group, tapos hindi ka pumasa sa required nila, may plus yung height nila. Yun yung alam ko. And some of just like for in teachers, I don't know if my memory serves me right. Sabi kasi nung kaibigan kong teacher na yung scores raw nila sa board exam ata yun, may plus sila. May plus 1 ba yun? Plus 3. Hindi ko alam. Ewan ko lang ngayon. Pero ganun daw yun. They are giving privileges to those members of a cultural group or ethnic group. User norms or program norms. Norming a test, especially with the participation of a nationally representative normative sample, can be a very expensive proposition. For this reason, some test manuals provide what are variously known as user norms or program norms, which consist of descriptive statistics based on a group of test takers in a given period of time rather than norms obtained by formal sampling method. That's according to Nelson 1994, page 283. And by understanding how norms are derived through formal sampling methods, this requires some discussion of the process of sampling that will be discussed on the chapter 4, part 2. That's the end of chapter 4, part 1.
Good morning, everyone. I am Rihanna Kim Sanchez, and one of my topics is sampling to develop norms. Now, first, A normative sample is that a group of people whose performance on particular test is analyzed for reference in evaluating the performance of individual test takers. Whether broad or narrow in scope, members of the normative sample will all be typical with respect to some characteristic of the people for whom the particular test was designed. The verb to norm, as well as related terms such as norming, refer to the process of deriving norms. Race norming is the controversial practice of norming on the basis of the race or ethnic background. Norming a test, especially with the participation of the nationally representative normative sample, can be a very expensive proposition. For this reason, some test manuals provide what are variously known as user norms or program norms, which consist of descriptive statistics based on the group of test takers in a given period of time rather than norms obtained by formal sampling methods. Now here is a close-up on how standard is standard in measurement. The word standard can be a noun or an adjective. In either case, it may have a multiple and quite different definition. As a noun, standard may be defined as that which other are compared to or evaluated against. The standard of educational and psychological testing usually referred to simply as the standards. As an adjective, standard of fan refers to what is usual, generally accepted, or commonly employed. The verb to standardize refers to making or transforming something into something that can serve as a basis of comparison or judgment. Conceivably, the term standardization could be applied to standardizing all the elements of standardized tests that need to be standardized. Thus, for the standardized test of leadership, we might speak of standardizing the definition of leadership, standardizing test administration instructions, standardizing test scoring, standardizing test interpretation, and so forth. One definition of standardization as applied to tests is the process employed to introduce objectivity and uniformity into test administrations, scoring, and interpretation. Now we have the type of standard error of measurement. A statistic used to estimate the extent to which an observed score deviates from a true score. Standard error of estimate in regression, an estimate of the degree of the error involved predicting the value of one variable from another. A standard error of the mean, a measure of sampling error. Now, a standard error of the difference, a statistic used to estimate how large or different between two scores should be before the difference is considered. Now we have the sampling to develop norms. The process of administering a test to a representative sample of the test taker for the purpose of establishing norms is referred to as standardization or test standardization. Now it only means that is example ano niya is mag-administer kag test na ang purpose is mo-create kag acceptable, reliable, or valid na test para sa test takers for you to establish norms na referred to as standardization. Next is sampling. The process of selecting the portion of the universe deemed to be representative of the whole population. This population is the complete universe or set of individuals with at least one common observable characteristic. Now, sampling is a portion of the universe of people nga mo-represent na siya as a whole. Bale, magkuha lang kag particular group anin niya, then kani sila is magrepresent ni sila as a whole, as a universe na. Now, next is standard means. As a noun, standard may be defined as that which others are compared to or evaluated against. As an adjective, standard often refers to what is usual, generally accepted, or commonly employed. In some areas of psychology, there has been a need to create a new standard unit of measurement in interest of better understanding or quantifying particular phenomena. The verb to standardize refers to transforming something into something that can serve as the basis comparison. Now we have here the standardization or test standardization, a process of administering tests to representative sample of test takers for the purpose of establishing norms. Na-explain naman ito sa previous slide. Now we have to next. Stratified sampling. Excuse me. Process of developing a sample based on specific subgroups of population. For example, if you devise a public opinion test and wanted to sample the opinions of Manhattan residents with this instrument, it would be desirable to include in your sample people representing different subgroups or strata of the population, such as black, whites, Asians, the other non-whites, males, females, the poor, the middle class, the rich, the professional people, business people, office workers, skilled and unskilled laborers, and unemployed homemakers. Now here, ang ginapasabot niya, if ever example niya diriya is if naakay buhaton nga public opinion test nga ang target nimo is sa Manhattan residents, it would be desirable to include in your sample ang katong nag-represent of different subgroups or strata sa katong population, which is mo to example ganiha nga black and whites, Asian, other non-whites, male and females, and etc. So next, stratified random sampling, process of developing a sample based on specific subgroups of population in which every member has the same chance of being included in the sample. So here, ang example ani niya is everyone has a chance nga mapili as a sample. So, kung balik ko na to gamit tong example na to ganiha, nga katong mga subgroups na to, nga katong blacks and white, Asian and non, pwede ta ato magkuha ta dari sa Asian og one sample. Next na po dito as sa non-Asian, magkuha na po ta sa kato na pong sa black, sa whites, magkuha ta ato og isa-isa, then mo na ihang ginapasabot. Everyone has a chance to be included in your sample. Now next is purposive sample. Arbitrarily select some sample because it is believed to be representative of the population. For example, the manufacturer might test a product in a market such as Cleveland because on the basis of experience with this particular product, how goes Cleveland, so goes the nation. The designer in using such a purposive sample is that the sample, in this case, Cleveland resident, may no longer be representative of the nation. Alternatively, this sample may simply not be representative of the national preferences with regard to the particular product being marketed. Now, for example, magtest ka og product sa barangay Apokon og kanang particular product na nakakuha og higher percentage rate based sa ilang experience sa product, so that concludes nga ang product sa akong gitest sa Apokon is makakuha gihapon siya og same na percentage kung i-test na ko siya sa tibuok Tagum. Ang naka-disadvantage lang advantage ani lang niya na test is that nagstick lang ka sa usa ka lugar and there might be possibilities na ang test preference sa taga Apokon dili mo matches sa taste sa tibuok Tagum. So, ang imuhang keyword lang this is how goes, so goes the nation. So, next. Incidental sample, inconvenient sample, involves the sample being drawn from that part of the population that is close to hand. For example, the group of children and adolescents who serve as the normative sample for one well-known children's intelligence test. The sample was selected to reflect key demographic variables representative of the U.S. population according to the latest available census data. Kini siya is kung kinsay convenience nga pwede nilang mahimong sample. Okay. Next is developing norms for a standardized test. Now here is the types of norms. First is we have the percentile norms. are the raw data from a test standardization sample converted to percentile form. A percentage correct refers to distribution of raw scores. Example is a way to measure our school performances if is through test and examination. If maayo atong performance, possible na dako ang percentage na makuha nato sa atong grades. Next is the age norms. Age norms or age equivalent scores indicate the average performance of different sample test takers who were at the various ages to indicate the average performance of different sample test takers who were at the various ages at the time test was admitted. Example is naghatag kag test for different ages aiming to evaluate kung unsa na ang range sa edad ang makakuhag dako na score sa test ug unsa na age ang makakuhag gamay na score sa test. Now next is the grade norms. Designed to indicate the average test performance of test takers in a given school grade. Just like for example, way back in high school, mo take tag different assessment na mo determine if taas ba atong grade or mark na makuha with that specific subject para maka-proceed ka sa another grade level. So mag-test lang gud gihapon ka ani no. Like gikan sa grade 1, di-test ka, then ang imong brain is pwede pang grade 2 mo, tayo paamba ka nila sa grade 2. Now, next is national norms. Derived from a normative sample that was national representative of the population at the time the norming study was conducted. Now, for example, ani, is the national election na yung mga surveys na nag-aim kung kinsa sa mga official candidate running for presidency ang taas og ranking pag-abot sa boto sa mga tao. Next is national anchor norms. Provide some stability to test scores by anchoring them to another test scores. So kini siya is tahay na human na ta atong kuha sa katong ranking atong pag-abot sa boto sa mga tao. Diri as sa national anchor norms, kinahanglan nimo og kanang stability sa imuhang mga test scores. Like, suportaan nimo imong test by providing the same test aiming kung naabay changes na mahitabo. Okay, next. Next is we have the subgroups. Subgroup norms. A normative sample can be segmented by any of the criteria initially used in selecting subjects for the sample. Magkuha kag subgroup na mo represent as a whole. Mo lang to siya. Example na niya. Now, next is the local norms. Local norms, typically developed by test users themselves, provide normative information with respect to the local's population's performance on some tests. Mag-base lang ka sa small group, example like 6 students sa UMTC. Nakagina-base sa mga small group. Next is fixed reference group scoring system. The distribution of scores obtained on the test from one group to test takers is used as the basis for the calculation of the test scores for the future administrations of the test. So kani siya is mo na ni ang result sa imuhang sampling sa katong data gathering. Example on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate the effectivity of online class sa mga psychology student? And next is norm reference versus criterion referred evaluation. Kani siya is criterion reference testing and assessment, defined as a method of evaluating and a way of deriving meaning from test scores of evaluating an individual scores with reference to a set standard. The criterion and criterion reference assessment typically derives from the values of or standards or of individual or organization, also been referred to as domain or content reference testing and assessment. So diri is na lang tayo follow standard criteria. Next is norm reference testing and assessment. Is a method of evaluating and a way of deriving meaning from test scores by evaluating an individual test taker's score and comparing it to scores of a group of test takers. Dria is na mahitabo nga comparison when it comes to evaluating test scores. Next is culture and inference. In interpreting assessment data from a set of different generation, it would seem useful to keep in mind whether satellites had or had not flashed in the sky. In other words, historical context should not be lost sight of evolution. That is according to Rogler 2002. Here it means that inference is using observation and background to reach a logical conclusion. You probably practice an inference every day. For example, if you see someone eating a new food and he or she makes a face, then you infer he does not like it. Now that would be all. Thank you for listening.